Picture this. It is the winter of 1979. Cold, dead air hangs over Atlantic City, New Jersey. The boardwalk is mostly empty at this hour. The casinos are still being built. Steel skeletons rising against the black night sky. Cranes frozen in place like iron giants. The smell of salt water and construction dust mixes in the air. Inside a modest home in a quiet neighborhood, a man named Vincent Falcone is sitting down for what he believes is a normal evening. Falcone is a cement contractor. He is a big man, physically. Broad shoulders, confident bearing. He has made some remarks recently. Careless remarks, the kind men make when they think no one important is listening. He called a local mob figure a little guy. He told people around him that this particular figure was not to be taken seriously, that he was small, that he was nothing. The man he said this about is Nicodemo Scarfo. And tonight, Vincent Falcone is going to die for those words. Philip Leonetti, Scarfo's own nephew, walks up behind Falcone and puts 2 bullets in the back of his head. Falcone's body crumples forward. He is dead before he hits the floor. Scarfo watches. And according to everyone who was in that room, according to sworn testimony given years later in federal courtrooms, Nicodemo Scarfo does not flinch, does not look away, does not show a single second of hesitation or regret. He smiles. A man is dead on the floor in front of him, and he smiles because someone dared to call him a little guy. And now that man will never say anything again. That is who we are talking about tonight. That is the kind of man Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo was. He was not the most powerful mob boss in American history. He was not the richest. He was not the smartest. But the FBI, who spent a decade trying to bring him down, would later describe him as possibly the most savage, the most paranoid, and the most dangerous boss that organized crime in America had ever produced, a man who killed not just for business, but for pleasure, for pride, for the sheer satisfaction of knowing that he could. By the time this story ends, he will have ordered the deaths of approximately 30 people. This is a full, complete, unvarnished story of Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo, the boss who trusted nobody and in doing so destroyed everybody, including himself. Stay with me, because this story is unlike anything else in the history of American organized crime, and the ending is one of the most devastating falls from power you will ever hear about. Before we go any further, drop in the comments right now and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is. I read every single comment, and this community is one of the best things about this channel. If you are new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now. We tell real stories on this channel. The kind of stories that are so insane, so layered, and so deeply researched that Hollywood could not make them up. Hit the like button. Share this video with someone who loves true crime and gangster history. And let's get into this story properly, because Nicodemo Scarfo deserves the full treatment. This man's life was a masterpiece of violence, paranoia, ambition, and ultimately self-destruction. Let's go. March 8, 1929. The Great Depression is 1 month away from beginning. The stock market has not yet crashed, but the signs are everywhere. Bread lines are forming in the industrial neighborhoods. Men are losing jobs. Families are struggling, and the streets of New York City are already filled with men who have decided that the legal path to prosperity is not the path they intend to walk. Into this world, in the borough of Brooklyn, New York, a boy is born. His parents name him Nicodemo Domenico Scarfo. His father, Philip Scarfo, and his mother, Catherine, are Italian immigrants. Philip from Naples, Catherine from Calabria. 2 different regions of southern Italy, both renowned in equal measure for their beauty and for the fierce, uncompromising code of honor and vengeance that their people carry like a birthright. The Scarfo family is not a wealthy family. They are workers, laborers, people who came to America with almost nothing and built a life through hard work, and, in the case of the men around young Nicodemo, through an organization that many in their community knew simply as a life. Because the Scarfo family is not just an ordinary Italian immigrant family. On his mother's side, Nicodemo has uncles, 3 of them named Nicholas, Joseph, and Michael Piccolo. These 3 men are not ordinary workers. They are members of the Genovese crime family, one of the most powerful organized crime organizations in the United States. They are what the mob calls made men, fully initiated members of La Cosa Nostra, protected by the code of the Mafia, earning their living through gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and whatever else the family required of them. From the very first moments of his conscious life, Nicodemo Scarfo is surrounded by the culture, the language, the values, and the violence of organized crime. This is not something that happens to him later in life. This is the air he breathes from the beginning. The stories he hears at the dinner table are stories of respect and retribution. The men he looks up to are men who command fear. The world he grows up in teaches him one lesson above all others. Power is the only thing that matters, and power is earned through the willingness to do what ordinary men will not. When Nicodemo is 12 years old, his family leaves Brooklyn and moves to South Philadelphia, a neighborhood that in the early 1940s is one of the most densely Italian-American communities in the entire country. Row houses packed tight on narrow streets. The smell of tomato sauce and cigarette smoke. Men standing on corners, watching. A world where everyone knows everyone, where reputation is currency, and where the Philadelphia crime family, one of the most established mafia organizations outside of New York, has its roots, its culture, and its unspoken authority embedded in the very fabric of daily life. Young Nicodemo fits right in, and yet he does not, because even among the tough men of South Philadelphia, even among the sons of mobsters and laborers and men who've done hard time, there is something about Nicodemo Scarfo that makes people uncomfortable. Something in the eyes, something in the way he reacts to challenges. He is small, 5 feet, 5 inches tall, which in the hyper-masculine world of the American Mafia in mid-20th century South Philadelphia is not an insignificant thing. Height, physicality, and the projection of physical dominance matter deeply in this world. Men are measured by how much space they take up, by how they carry themselves, by whether other men step aside when they approach or hold their ground. Nicodemo Scarfo does not have the luxury of physical intimidation by virtue of size, but what he lacks in stature, he compensates for with something far more dangerous than muscle, an explosive, volcanic, completely disproportionate temper that erupts without warning and without any apparent sense of consequence. He graduates from Benjamin Franklin High School in 1947. The records show him as a young man of average academic performance. What the records don't show is the reputation he is already building on the street. As someone with a hair trigger, as someone who takes offense at things other men would shrug off, as someone who does not calculate the cost of his reactions before he makes them. He tries boxing. This makes sense. It's the 1940s at South Philly, and boxing is one of the legitimate avenues available to young men of limited means. He trains at small clubs around the Philadelphia area, and in the ring he shows the same qualities he shows on the street. Aggression, absolute refusal to back down, and a kind of reckless commitment to attack that ignores his own vulnerability. He is not good enough to turn professional. His boxing career ends quietly. Another door closing, another reminder that the conventional paths do not seem to open for Nicodemo Scarfo. But one path is wide open, because while his boxing career is going nowhere, his uncle Nicholas Nicky Buck Piccolo is a soldier in the Philadelphia crime family, the same uncle who had connections to the Genovese family back in New York. Through Nicky Buck, young Nicodemo gets his introduction to the actual machinery of organized crime. He starts working at his uncle's bar. He begins handling small tasks, carrying messages, keeping books, making collections. He learns the hierarchy, the protocol, the language, the rules. He takes to it immediately and completely. The life gives Nicodemo Scarfo something the boxing ring and the factory floor never could, a sense of power, of consequence, of being feared and respected. Here, his lack of physical stature matters less. Here, what matters is willingness. Willingness to do the things that need doing, to carry out orders without hesitation, to demonstrate through action that you belong. In 1954, at the age of 25, Nicodemo Domenico Scarfo is formally inducted into the Philadelphia crime family. The ceremony takes place in New Jersey. The boss at the time is Joseph Ida. The ritual is the ancient one. The cutting of the trigger finger, the burning of a holy card, the oath sworn on blood never betray the family, an oath whose violation, everyone in the room understands, means death. Scarfo takes the oath. He means it, or at least he believes he means it. He is a made man now, official, protected, part of La Cosa Nostra. He starts as a bookmaker. taking bets, running numbers in South Philadelphia. He is good at it. He is sharp with money, organized in his operations, reliable in his collections. His bosses notice. His reputation within the family begins to build. But the temper is always there, always waiting. And in 1963, it erupts in a way that changes the entire trajectory of Nicodemo Scarfo's life. It is 1963. Nicodemo Scarfo is 34 years old, a soldier in the Philadelphia crime family, running bookmaking operations and making a reasonable name for himself. He is not yet a major figure. He is not yet someone that anyone outside the family would recognize or fear. But inside the organization, he is a known quantity, reliable, ambitious, volatile. One evening, he walks into a South Philadelphia diner. The specifics of what exactly happens next vary slightly depending on which account you read, but the core facts are not in dispute. There is an argument over a booth, a seat. A man named William Dugan, a longshoreman, a big man, a man with no connection to mob, is sitting in a spot that Scarfo wants, or refuses to give up a spot that Scarfo believes should be his. The argument escalates. Words are exchanged, and Nicodemo Scarfo, 34 years old and a made member of one of the most powerful crime families in America, pulls out a knife and stabs William Dugan. Dugan does not die, but he is seriously wounded, and the incident is public witnessed undeniable. The police respond. Charges are filed. Scarfo pleads guilty and serves time in prison. The legal consequence is bad, but the consequence within the Philadelphia crime family is worse, because Angelo Bruno, the boss of the Philadelphia family since 1959, a man known throughout the American Mafia as the Docile Don or the Gentle Don, a man who built his empire on the principle that violence should be used as a last resort and never for something as petty and stupid as a fight over a restaurant seat, is furious. Angelo Bruno is everything that Nicodemo Scarfo is not. He is measured. He is diplomatic. He is strategic. He understands that violence is a tool, not a hobby, and that unnecessary violence attracts exactly the kind of attention that a criminal organization cannot afford. Bruno has spent years building the Philadelphia family into a smooth, professional operation, one that stays out of the newspapers, keeps law enforcement at arm's length, and earns money quietly and consistently. And now one of his soldiers has stabbed a longshoreman over a restaurant booth. Bruno's response is swift and definitive. Nicodemo Scarfo is being sent to Atlantic City. In 1964, this is essentially a punishment. Atlantic City, New Jersey, is not the glittering casino resort it will later become. In 1964, it is a faded seaside town, a place that had its glory days in the first half of the 20th century and has since declined into something close to irrelevance. The boardwalk is dilapidated. The grand hotels are empty or converted into rooming houses. The economy is moribund. The population is declining. Young people are leaving. For a South Philadelphia mobster, being assigned to Atlantic City is not a promotion. It is exile. It is Bruno's way of removing a problem from his immediate surroundings, while still technically keeping Scarfo within the family structure, but keeping him far enough away that his volatile personality cannot cause embarrassment or draw heat. Scarfo knows this. He is not stupid. He understands exactly what Bruno's assignment means. He is not trusted. He is not valued. He is being sidelined, and the path to real power within the family runs through Philadelphia, not through a dying resort town 60 miles away. He goes to Atlantic City. He moves in with his mother, Catherine, who is running a boarding house there. He brings his family. He settles into the grim reality of running a small-time gambling and loan sharking operation in a place with no money and no future. And he waits. This is perhaps the most underappreciated aspect of Nicodemo Scarfo's character. The patience. Because the same man who will later become notorious for explosive, impulsive violence is, in the 1960s, capable of extraordinary patience when he understands that patience is his only option. He cannot fight his way out of this exile. He cannot charm his way out. He can only endure it, build what he can with what he has, and wait for circumstances to change. He runs his operation in Atlantic City with his nephew Philip Leonetti, who has come to live with Scarfo and who becomes, over the years that follow, his closest associate, his shadow, his right hand. Leonetti is the child of Scarfo's sister, Annunziata. He comes under his uncle's wing as a young boy, and what Scarfo builds in Atlantic City. He builds with Leonetti beside him. The operation is small. Gambling, loan sharking, some local rackets. The money is modest. The power is limited and the world is small. But Scarfo does not waste these years. He uses them to study the city, to understand its geography and its people and its political structure, to identify who holds power and how that power flows. He cultivates relationships with local politicians and businessmen. He inserts himself into the labor unions that operate in the construction industry. He makes himself known to the right people in ways that are not obviously criminal. He is a local businessman, a man who knows people, a man who can get things done. And then, in 1976, the world changes. The state of New Jersey legalizes casino gambling in Atlantic City. The announcement is made by Governor Brendan Byrne at an event on the boardwalk. And the message is clear. Atlantic City is going to be rebuilt, transformed, turned into a Las Vegas of the East Coast. Billions of dollars are going to flow into this city. Casinos are going to be built. Hotels are going to rise from the ruins of the old resort town. Construction crews are going to swarm the city. Money, enormous, staggering amounts of money, is coming. And Nicodemo Scarfo is already there. He has been there for 12 years, building relationships, embedding himself in the local economy, understanding the labor unions and the construction industry and the political machinery that governs the city. When the gambling boom arrives, he is not an outsider trying to muscle in. He is already inside. He is the Philadelphia family's established presence in the most valuable piece of real estate in the American underworld. The exile that was meant to destroy him has instead positioned him perfectly for the greatest opportunity in the history of organized crime on the East Coast. But before Nicodemo Scarfo can fully capitalize on what Atlantic City is about to become, the world around him needs to change in other ways too. And the man who needs to move out of the way is the man who put him there in the first place, Angelo Bruno. To understand what Nicodemo Scarfo would eventually become and what he would eventually destroy, you must first understand Angelo Bruno. Because Bruno's 21-year reign over the Philadelphia crime family is not just a backdrop to the Scarfo story. It is its direct opposite. Everything Scarfo is, Bruno is not. Everything Scarfo does, Bruno refused to do. The contrast between these two men illuminates the entire tragedy that follows. Angelo Bruno was born in Sicily in 1910 and came to the United States as a child. He rose through the ranks of the Philadelphia crime family slowly and carefully, and when he became boss in 1959, he imposed on the organization a philosophy that was, for organized crime, almost revolutionary in its restraint. He wanted peace. Not peace as weakness, peace as business strategy. Bruno understood that the most profitable criminal organization is not the most violent one. It is the most stable one. Violence attracts law enforcement. Violence kills earners. Violence destabilizes the relationships and the structures that make criminal enterprises profitable over the long term. The New York family spent years killing each other, going to mattresses, burning through leadership and resources in internecine warfare. Bruno watched all that and made a different choice. He negotiated. He built alliances. He treated disputes through conversation rather than bloodshed. He was deeply connected to the New York families, particularly the Genovese family, which had historical ties to the Philadelphia organization, and he used those connections to maintain the family standing in the National Commission of Organized Crime without becoming embroiled in the endless power struggles that consumed other families. Under Bruno, the Philadelphia family was known for bookmaking, loan sharking, and numbers running. It was a steady, professional operation that avoided the drug trade. Bruno was famously opposed to family involvement in narcotics, partly on moral grounds, but mostly on strategic ones. Drug trafficking brought federal attention of a particular intensity that Bruno wanted no part of. The family made good money. Not spectacular money. Not the kind of money the New York families were making, but consistent, reliable money earned without the chaos of constant warfare. Bruno's men were stable. His leadership was respected, if not feared. And then Atlantic City legalized gambling. This is where the story of Bruno's peaceful kingdom begins to crack. Because the casino boom suddenly made the territory that Bruno controlled, the territory he had managed with such quiet professionalism for 21 years, worth incomparably more than it had ever been. Suddenly, Every crime family in New York was looking at Atlantic City and seeing opportunity. The Genovese family, the Gambino family, the Lucchese family, they all wanted a piece of what was being built on the Jersey Shore. Bruno's response was what it had always been: negotiation, alliance, mutual respect. He believed he could manage the situation diplomatically, the way he had managed every other situation for 2 decades. But there were men within his own family who believed he was wrong. Men who thought the casino boom demanded aggression, not diplomacy. Men who were watching billions of dollars flow through Atlantic City and felt that Bruno's cautious, restrained approach was leaving an enormous fortune on the table. Chief among them was Antonio Caponigro, Bruno's own consigliere, the 3rd highest-ranking official in the Philadelphia family. Caponigro had grown impatient with Bruno's approach. He believed that a more aggressive leadership, one willing to demand a larger share of the Atlantic City money and willing to use force to get it, was what the family needed. Caponigro reached out to elements within the Genovese family in New York. He got what he believed was approval, or at least tacit consent, for what he was planning. In hindsight, the signals he received were almost certainly misread, either deliberately or through wishful thinking. On the evening of March 21st, 1980, Angelo Bruno finishes a quiet dinner at Causolo, Italy, a restaurant in South Philadelphia. He gets into a car and is driven back to his home on Snyder Avenue. He is sitting in the passenger seat. The car pulls up in front of his house. A shotgun blast through the car window ends Angelo Bruno's life instantly. The docile Don is dead. 21 years of peace end in a single moment on a quiet South Philadelphia street. The Philadelphia mob will never be peaceful again. Within the organization, the immediate response is shock, grief, and then, almost immediately, the raw scramble for power. Bruno's underboss, Philip Chicken Man Testa, is elevated to boss by the New York Commission, which has to approve any change in leadership of an affiliated family. Testa also promotes Nicodemo Scarfo, who has been watching events from Atlantic City with intense interest, to underboss. But Caponigro, the man who organized Bruno's murder, faces a reckoning almost immediately. He had not, as it turned out, gotten the approval he thought he had from the Genovese family. Killing a boss without the explicit authorization of the Commission is one of the most severe violations of Mafia law. The Commission's response is swift and brutal. Caponigro's body is found in the trunk of a car in the Bronx, shot dozens of times, with $300 in cash bills stuffed into his mouth and into his body cavities, a signal to the entire underworld that his sin was one of greed, and that greed of that kind had a price. So Bruno is dead, Caponigro is dead, and Philip Testa is now the boss of Philadelphia. Testa is a formidable figure, a hard man who earned his position through decades of work and violence. He has the nickname Chicken Man, not because of any weakness, but because he once operated a legitimate poultry business. He is respected by the men around him and feared by his enemies. But Testa has enemies within the family itself. His elevation to boss has created resentments, and those resentments have been nursed in silence by men who believe they were passed over, underpaid, or insufficiently valued. Among them is his own underboss, Peter Casella, and a captain named Frank Narducci Sr. On March 15, 1981, less than a year after Bruno's assassination, Philip Testa returns to his home in South Philadelphia after a night out. As he reaches the front porch and puts his key in the door, a nail bomb packed with roofing nails and planted beneath the floorboards of his porch detonates. The explosion is so powerful that it blows Testa through the front door of his own home. He dies from his injuries. 2 bosses, murdered in less than a year. Philadelphia is in chaos. And now, for the first time, the throne is genuinely within reach for the man from Atlantic City with the short fuse and the long memory. Nicodemo Scarfo presents himself to the New York Commission for consideration as the new boss of Philadelphia. He is endorsed. The reasons are partly practical. He is the underboss, the next in the line of succession, and partly because the New York families, particularly the Genovese family, believe that a Scarfo-led Philadelphia will be more aggressive in monetizing the Atlantic City boom, which benefits everyone in the Commission. Testa's murder is dealt with quickly and decisively. Peter Casella, identified as one of the conspirators, is banished from the mob and flees to Florida, where he will later be found dead, the punishment for his role eventually catching up with him. Frank Narducci Sr., another conspirator, is shot and killed not long after, the trigger pulled in retaliation for what he had done. And Salvatore Testa, Philip's son, a rising star in the family, a young man who is already making a name for himself as one of the most capable and feared soldiers in Philadelphia, is given the blessing to avenge his father's murder. He will avenge it comprehensively. But first, the new boss of Philadelphia needs to establish himself. And establishing himself is something that Nicodemo little Nicky Scarfo is going to do in a way that nobody in the history of the Philadelphia family has ever done before. With ferocity, a comprehensiveness, and a systematic brutality that will reshape the city's underworld forever. 1981, Nicodemo Scarfo is 52 years old. He has spent 17 years in Atlantic City, years at My Broken a Different Man, years and another story will be remembered as the wasted middle act of a forgettable criminal career. But Scarfo has used every one of those years. He has studied, he has built, he has cultivated allies and identified enemies. He has embedded himself in the construction industry and the labor unions of New Jersey's fastest growing city. He has waited with a patience that is almost impossible to reconcile with the explosive volatility the world will later see. And now the throne is his. His first act as boss is to appoint his inner circle. He promotes Salvatore Chucky Merlino to underboss. He names Frank Monti as his consigliere. And most significantly, he keeps his nephew Philip Leonetti close. At this point still a soldier, but clearly the man Scarfo trusts above all others, the man who is already functioning as his eyes and ears, his enforcer and his confidant. The organizational structure of the Philadelphia family under Scarfo includes a collection of captains, capos, who oversee specific crews in specific geographic areas. Among them are names that will become deeply significant as this story unfolds. Lawrence Merlino, the brother of underboss Chucky Merlino. Thomas Tommy Del Giorno, a capable earner who runs gambling operations. Nicholas Nicky Crow Caramandi, a hitman and racketeer whose nickname the Crow refers to his ability to spot a deal or scam from across the room. Joey Pungator, a loyal soldier. Francis Faffi Iannarella. Charlie White Ionis. And Salvatore Salvi Testa, the young prince, the son of the murdered boss, already being groomed by Scarfo himself as a crown prince, a successor, a protege. Testa is extraordinary by any measure. At 25 years old when Scarfo takes over, he is already one of the most feared men in Philadelphia. He is handsome, charismatic, enormously capable, and possessed of a coldness when it comes to violence that even hardened men find remarkable. He has killed at least 15 men by the time he reaches his late 20s. He is a millionaire from his loan sharking and gambling operations. He is beloved by the men around him and absolutely trusted by Scarfo, or so Scarfo says. From the very first days of his leadership, Scarfo makes clear that his administration is going to be different from Bruno's in every conceivable way. Under Bruno, violence was the last resort. Under Scarfo, violence is the first resort. Under Bruno, disputes were mediated, negotiated, resolved through conversation when possible. Under Scarfo, disputes are resolved at the end of a gun, and the message being sent is more important than any specific outcome. One of Scarfo's first moves as boss is to impose a street tax, a tribute that any criminal operating in Philadelphia or South Jersey must pay to his family, whether they are a member of the Mafia or not. Drug dealers, independent bookmakers, loan sharks, pimps, numbers runners. Anyone making criminal money in territory that Scarfo declares his own must pay a weekly tribute. This is not unprecedented in organized crime, but the aggressiveness and the comprehensiveness with which Scarfo enforces it is extraordinary. Those who pay are left alone. Those who refuse to pay or who pay too slowly or who complain about the requirement are beaten, robbed, or killed. The message goes out to the underworld of Philadelphia and South Jersey with unmistakable clarity. The rules have changed, and the new boss does not negotiate. The street tax brings insignificant money. It also brings an enemy's resentments and a seething anger among independent criminals who feel that Scarfo is overstepping, taxing people who have no obligation to him, inserting himself into operations that were functioning perfectly well without his involvement. But Scarfo does not care about resentment. He cares about control. and control in his worldview is maintained through one mechanism above all others: fear. At around the same time, he is also beginning to build the Atlantic City operation in earnest. The casino construction boom is in full swing. Billions of dollars in construction contracts are being let. Hotels are being built. The boardwalk is being transformed. And at every step, Scarfo's tentacles are reaching into the process, through the construction unions, through the concrete and cement suppliers, through the political machinery that issues permits and approvals. He creates a concrete company, Scarf Incorporated, that becomes a required supplier for major construction projects in Atlantic City. Contractors who want to build on the boardwalk understand very quickly that they are going to be doing business with Scarfo's company, whether they want to or not. Those who resist are visited by men who make the situation plain. The money pouring into Scarfo's operation during the early 1980s is staggering. The casino boom, combined with the street tax and the traditional mob rackets, gambling, loan sharking, union corruption, makes the Philadelphia family richer than it has ever been under any previous boss. But before we get too deep into the money, we need to talk about what Scarfo is doing to the people around him during this same period. Because the financial success of his early years as boss is completely inseparable from the body count. These things happen simultaneously, and they cannot be understood separately. The violence that Scarfo brings to his role as boss is not simply tactical. It is personal. It is almost recreational. And it begins immediately. To understand Nicodemo Scarfo as a boss, you need to understand that for him, ordering a murder is not a difficult decision that keeps him up at night. It is not a reluctant last resort. It is, by all account of the men who were around him, almost a preference, a reflexive response to problems that other bosses would solve through conversation, negotiation, or simply letting things go. He kills, according to the testimony gathered over years of FBI investigation, for many reasons. He kills for money, of course, removing rivals, silencing witnesses, settling debts. But he also kills for pride, for respect, for the feeling of absolute power that comes from knowing that a word from him ends a life. And sometimes, extraordinarily, he kills simply because someone said something about him that he did not like. We have already discussed Vincent Falcone, the contractor who made the fatal mistake of underestimating Scarfo and calling him a little guy. Falcone was murdered in 1979, before Scarfo even became boss, shot twice in the back of the head by Philip Leonetti. Scarfo ordered that killing not because Falcone was a rival or a threat to his power in any organizational sense, but because his dignity, that fragile, precious thing that Scarfo guards more ferociously than any business interest, had been wounded. In 1978, a year before the Falcone murder, Scarfo is involved in an even more audacious act of violence that gives some sense of how far his recklessness and his contempt for consequences can take him. A judge named Edwin Helfand has refused to accept a $12,500 bribe that was being offered on behalf of Scarfo's associate Nicholas Nick the Blade Virgilio, who is facing murder charges and wants a lighter sentence. Helfand has not just refused the bribe. He has refused it in a way that Scarfo finds personally insulting, a rejection not just of the money but the power that the money represented. Scarfo's response is to order the judge's assassination. Judge Helfand is eating dinner with his wife at a restaurant in Cape May Courthouse when Virgilio walks in and shoots him multiple times. Scarfo acts as the getaway driver. A sitting judge is murdered in a public restaurant while having dinner with his family because he refused a bribe and because Nicodemo Scarfo wanted to make a point about what happens to people who defy him. This is not the act of a rational criminal organization trying to stay out of the spotlight. This is the act of a man who has crossed the line from organized criminality into something that functions much more like a personal reign of terror. Once Scarfo becomes boss in 1981, the murders come faster. The Ricabene War is one of the most significant early episodes of violence during his tenure. Harry Hunchback Ricabene is an aging captain in the Philadelphia family, a man who has been part of the organization for decades and who commands a faction of soldiers that, in the chaos following Bruno's and Testa's murders, begins to operate somewhat independently of Scarfo's authority. Ricabene does not openly challenge Scarfo's position as boss, but he does not fully submit to it either. He runs his own operations, keeps his own counsel, and makes clear through his behavior that he regards himself as something of an independent power within the family, a man with his own history, and his own standing that cannot simply be swept away by the new boss's ambition. This is exactly the kind of ambiguity that Nicodemo Scarfo cannot tolerate. In Scarfo's worldview, there is no middle ground between loyalty and betrayal. You are either fully under his authority, or you are an enemy. Rickabene's independence, even if it falls far short of open rebellion, is classified in Scarfo's mind as a threat that must be eliminated. Between 1982 and 1984, the Philadelphia family fights what amounts to a civil war. Scarfo's faction, which includes Salvatore Testa, Philip Leonetti, and a collection of younger, hungry soldiers, wages a campaign of murder against Riccabene and his allies. Rickabene's brother is killed. His associates are picked off one by one. Riccabene himself survives multiple assassination attempts. In one extraordinary incident, he is shot 5 times in the face and survives, before eventually being captured by law enforcement on unrelated charges and sentenced to life in prison, removing him from the equation without Scarfo having to kill him personally. The war costs both sides dearly. Men are dead. Men are wounded. The streets of Philadelphia and South Jersey are running with blood, and the FBI, which has been watching organized crime in Philadelphia for years, is intensifying surveillance in response to the escalating violence. But Scarfo does not seem to care about the FBI's attention. Or rather, he cares about it in the same way he cares about most threats. He believes he can handle it through the same mechanism he handles everything else. Through fear, through violence, through the absolute conviction that he is untouchable. During this period, between 1982 and 1984, Scarfo himself is actually imprisoned for a stretch. He is serving time at FCI La Tuna in Texas on a federal gun possession charge. He is inside for approximately 18 months. And here, in what is one of the most revealing details of his personality, he does not become humble, cautious, or reflective. He manages to cultivate associates of the Mexican Mafia while inside, men he calls his pistoleros, who serve as his bodyguards within the prison. He runs his family's operations from his cell through intermediaries, issuing orders, receiving reports, maintaining control as best he can across the distance. He is released in January 1984. The city he returns to is one that has been shaped by the ongoing warfare, friends and enemies more clearly defined. The family's reach extended, but also its exposure increased. The Riccabene War is winding down. The money is flowing, and Salvatore Testa is waiting. The young prince, the man Scarfo has treated almost like a son, has performed brilliantly during the boss's absence. He has killed ruthlessly in service of Scarfo's interests. He has avenged his own father's murder, hunting down and personally killing Rocco Boom Boom Marinucci, the man who built the bomb that blew up Philip Testa, finding him in a parking lot in South Philadelphia and shooting him in the neck, chest, and head, stuffing his mouth with large, unexploded firecrackers as a particularly grim message. Testa has demonstrated, over and over, absolute loyalty and extraordinary capability. He is 27 years old and already a legend in the Philadelphia mob. If there's one man in the family that everyone agrees is essential, irreplaceable, and genuinely beloved, it is Salvi Testa, which makes what Nicodemo Scarfo does next the most revealing and ultimately most destructive decision of his entire career. To understand why Nicodemo Scarfo decided to murder Salvatore Testa, you have to understand the psychological architecture of paranoia. Because what drives a decision to kill the most capable and loyal soldier in the entire family is not evidence of betrayal. It is not a specific act of disloyalty. It is not even a particular incident that can be pointed to as a catalyst. It is pure, corrosive, irrational paranoia, the same paranoia that, once it metastasizes in a boss's mind, will eventually consume everyone around him. Scarfo looks at Salvatore Testa, and he does not see a loyal ally. He sees a threat. He sees a young man who is beloved by the soldiers around him, who earns enormous amounts of money, who has demonstrated extraordinary capability, and who, most crucially in Scarfo's fevered mind, has the kind of natural authority and charisma that makes men follow him not out of fear, but out of genuine admiration. That kind of authority is, in Scarfo's worldview, inherently dangerous. A man who is loved rather than feared is a man who could, if he chose, draw other men away from their loyalty to the boss. Testa does not have to do anything actively threatening to become a threat in Scarfo's estimation. His mere existence as a beloved and capable figure is sufficient. There is also a personal element, suggested by the testimony of men who were there. There are accounts that Scarfo grows resentful of Testa's wealth and his independence. Testa's legitimate and illegitimate operations have made him a millionaire. He owns property. He has relationships and arrangements that don't run through Scarfo's approval. He is, in a quiet way, his own man, and Nicodemo Scarfo does not want anyone around him to be their own man. The trigger for the final decision is almost comic in its pettiness. Salvatore Testa had been engaged to the daughter of underboss Chucky Merlino, a planned April 1984 wedding that was to be a massive 700-guest celebration at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia, with French decor and custom tablecloths and the full pageantry of a mob prince's nuptials. And then, 2 months before the wedding, Testa calls it off. He has grown apart from Merlino's daughter. He doesn't want to marry her. He breaks the engagement. Chucky Merlino is furious, deeply personally insulted. He goes to Scarfo and tells him that Testa has disrespected his family, that this cannot stand. In a conversation that several witnesses would later confirm occurred, Merlino reportedly says plainly, "Salvi's got to go." Scarfo agrees. Whether this is driven by the personal insult of the broken engagement, by the longer simmering paranoia about Testa's growing power, or by some combination of both, the decision is made. Salvatore Testa, the crown prince of the Philadelphia mob, the most capable soldier in the family, the man who has personally committed murders on Scarfo's behalf and who has been loyal in every demonstrable way, is sentenced to death. The method is chilling in his betrayal. Testa is not going to be killed by an enemy or by a stranger or by someone who has reason to hate him. He is going to be killed by people he trusts completely, his best friends, his inner circle. Joey Pungatore, one of Testa's closest friends, a man who has grown up with him in the mob, a man Testa trusts without question, is recruited to be part of the murder plot. Pungatore's role is to lure Testa to the location where the killing will happen. He invites Testa to meet him at a candy store in South Philadelphia, a sweet shop of all places, a neighborhood place with no particular significance, chosen precisely because Testa would have no reason to be suspicious about going there with his best friend. Testa shows up. He has no idea what is happening. He is meeting Joey Pun for a casual conversation at a candy store on a September afternoon. It is the 14th of September, 1984. Multiple men are waiting. Salvatore Wayne Grande shoots Testa in the back of the head. Several more of Testa's friends shoot him as well. Men he has broken bread with. Men he has fought alongside. Men whose lives he had protected. His body is wrapped in a carpet with a rope around his neck and dumped at the side of a road in Gloucester Township, New Jersey. It is found there later that day. He is 28 years old. The reaction within the Philadelphia mob is unlike anything that follows any of the other murders during the Scarfo era. Those other deaths, men killed for crossing Scarfo, rivals eliminated for strategic reasons, are understood and accepted within the brutal logic of organized crime. But the death of Salvatore Testa registers differently. 300 people attend his funeral at St. Paul's Catholic Church in the Italian market section of Philadelphia. The grief is genuine, the sense of loss profound. Men who cry at nothing are crying at Salvi Testa's casket. And beneath the grief, something else, a cold, creeping fear. If Scarfo will kill Salvi Testa, the most loyal and capable man in the family, the son of the previous boss, the man Scarfo himself had treated like a son, then who in this organization is safe? If that kind of loyalty is no protection, if that kind of service earns you a bullet in the back of the head from your best friend in a candy store, then what exactly does it mean to be a member of this family? Thomas Del Giorno later says it plainly. The murder of Salvi Testa was the beginning of the end of the Scarfo regime, not because it weakened the family in any immediate operational sense, but because from that day forward, every man in the family woke up each morning not knowing that today was the day his name came up. Every man began quietly calculating his own vulnerability. Every man who had a reason to be afraid. And after Testa, everyone had a reason to be afraid, began to consider options that before would have been unthinkable, including the option of talking to the FBI. Even as the cracks begin to form, even as the fear spreads to the family like a cold virus, The late 1980s represent in pure financial terms the peak of Nicodemo Scarfo's power. The Atlantic City casino boom is in full swing. The money coming to the Philadelphia family's operations is extraordinary by any historical standard. The casino construction industry is Scarfo's golden goose. Every major casino project on the boardwalk, and the 1980s sees them rise one after another, each one larger and more extravagant than the last, must do business with Scarfo's people in some way. The concrete comes through companies connected to his family. The labor comes through unions that his family controls. Contractors who want their permits approved without delays, their inspections passed without problems, their projects completed on schedule, understand that cooperation with Scarfo's organization is not optional. The Trump Plaza opens in 1984. Caesars Atlantic City. Harrah's, Resorts International. Bally's Park Place. Each of these billion-dollar properties represents an opportunity for extortion, for labor racketeering, for construction kickbacks. The money flows up to a family structure to Scarfo himself in amounts that have been estimated by federal investigators who later reconstruct the financial picture to run into the tens of millions of dollars annually at the peak. Scarfo lives well during these years. He has homes in both Atlantic City and in Casapella, New Jersey. He wears expensive clothes and fur coats. He eats at the best restaurants. He projects the image of a successful businessman, which is, in a twisted sense, accurate. He is successful. His business happens to involve extortion, murder, and racketeering. But by the metrics of criminal enterprise, the early to mid-1980 Scarfo operation is a high-performing organization. The street tax continues to generate revenue from the countless independent criminals in the Philadelphia South Jersey area. Loan sharking operations, the family lending money at astronomical interest rates to desperate borrowers, collected with the threat and occasional reality of violence, bring in steady income. Illegal gambling, numbers, sports betting, card games. Drug money filters, and despite the official policy against narcotics, because the men around Scarfo understand that drug revenue is too large to entirely ignore, regardless of what the boss says for the record. Political corruption runs through the entire structure. City councilmen in Philadelphia are on the payroll. The case of Leland Beloff, a Philadelphia city councilman who was later convicted of participating in the extortion of developer Willard Rouse, is only the most visible example of a broader pattern of corruption that Scarfo's organization maintains at every level of local government and law enforcement. There is a moment, probably somewhere around 1984 or 1985, when Nicodemo Scarfo can look at what he has built and feel genuine satisfaction. He is the boss of a wealthy, powerful, feared crime family. He controls a major American city and its surrounding region. He has Atlantic City in his grip during the greatest economic boom in the city's history. The New York Commission respects him, or at least fears him sufficiently to treat him with deference. His men, most of them, are loyal and productive. For a man who spent 17 years in what was supposed to be a punishing exile, who was dismissed and underestimated and sent away to a dying city as a punishment for bad behavior. This is an extraordinary turnaround. He has outlasted the man who exiled him. He has survived the deaths of two bosses who stood between him and the throne. He has built an empire in the very city where he was supposed to fade into irrelevance. And yet the paranoia does not recede with success. If anything, success intensifies it. Because the more you have to lose. And the more you have to lose, the more suspicious you become of every person around you, every whispered conversation you are not part of, every loyalist whose loyalty you cannot absolutely verify. Scarfo begins to micromanage in ways that go beyond normal boss behavior. He wants to know not just the operational details of his family's activities, who is making what, who is dealing with whom, but the personal details of his men's lives. He wants to know where his captains are on weekends. He wants reports on conversations that he was not part of. He makes his men check in with regularity and reports any deviation from expected behavior with suspicion that escalates quickly to paranoid certainty. The men around him begin to feel what it is like to live under constant surveillance from their own boss. Every word becomes carefully chosen. Every meeting becomes an exercise in anxiety. The question that nobody asks out loud but that everyone lives with is always the same. Has he decided I'm disloyal? Has my name come up? Nicky Crow Caramandi later describes the atmosphere vividly. Caramandy was one of Scarfo's most feared hitmen, a man who had killed on command without hesitation, a man who by his own admission was not sentimental about violence or loyalty. And even Caramandy, the stone-cold professional killer, describes the Scarfo organization in the mid-1980s as a place of constant terror. Not terror of outside enemies. Terror of the boss. You never knew, Caramandy said, from one day to the next, Scarfo would turn on anybody, and he drew no lines when it came to killing. Most mob bosses were not like him. Most families operated on a predictable system where loyalty was rewarded and genuine betrayal was punished. In Scarfo's family, even perfect loyalty was no guarantee. Even the best soldier could be sentenced to death for something as abstract as being too popular, or for a slight that the boss had decided was unforgivable. Frankie Flowers D'Alfonso is another example. D'Alfonso is a bookmaker, a mob associate who ran gambling operations and paid tribute to the Philadelphia family. In 1985, Scarfo decides he wants more from D'Alfonso, more money, a larger tribute, a more explicit demonstration of submission. D'Alfonso resists. He is not a made man, not a formal member of the family, and he has operated independently for years under an arrangement that he considers settled. Scarfo orders him killed. D'Alfonso is beaten and murdered in 1985. The murder of D'Alfonso will later be the basis for Scarfo's life sentence, the first time in American history that a mob boss is personally convicted of first-degree murder. The list of those killed, ordered killed, or targeted for killing during Scarfo's tenure grows longer every year. Former allies fall out of favor and find themselves in the crosshairs. Men who have committed no offense greater than becoming wealthy enough to be envied are targeted. The organization consumes itself in a slow, relentless process of self-destruction that is visible to everyone except, apparently, the man at the center of it. If there's a single moment when the machinery begins to visibly turn against Nicodemo Scarfo, it is 1985, the Willard Rouse extortion. This is a moment when a decision made in a conference room in the Philadelphia mob's inner circle reaches outside the family structure and touches the FBI in a way that will ultimately prove fatal. Willard Rouse is a major commercial real estate developer, a prominent, legitimate businessman who is working on a major waterfront development project in Philadelphia. The project is significant and lucrative, involving property along the Delaware River, and it requires cooperation from city officials to move forward. Permits, approvals, the standard machinery of municipal development. Scarfo sees an opportunity. He orders Nicholas Caramandy and another associate to approach Rouse's people with a proposal in exchange for a $1 million payment, to be split between Scarfo and Philadelphia City Councilman Leland Beloff, who will ensure the project gets its approvals. Rouse can proceed with his development without difficulty. It is straightforward extortion, the kind of shakedown that organized crime has been running on legitimate businesses for decades. What Scarfo does not account for is Willard Rouse's response. Rouse is not a man who is going to quietly pay a criminal extortion to get his project moving. He contacts the FBI immediately and comprehensively. The FBI's response is equally comprehensive. They launch an undercover operation. An FBI agent poses as Rouse's representative, meets with Caramandy and the other associate, and participates in the negotiations. The operation is meticulously documented. Every meeting is recorded. Every demand is noted. The evidence is not circumstantial. It is a complete, detailed, prosecutable record of organized crime extortion involving a sitting city councilman and the boss of the Philadelphia Mafia. Caramandy is indicted in 1986. At this point, the decision he faces is among the starkest available to a man in his position. He can take the charges, go to trial, almost certain to be convicted on the strength of the FBI's documented evidence, and serve a lengthy sentence. Or he can flip. The decision is made more urgent by another factor. Caramandy has received word, through the prison network, through a message relayed from Philadelphia crime family member Raymond Martirano, that Scarfo is planning to have him killed. Whether this is accurate intelligence or a rumor planted specifically to push Caramandy toward cooperation, the effect is the same. Caramandy, already facing prison, is now calculating that if he goes back onto the street, he may not survive to face trial. He makes contact with the FBI. He agrees to cooperate. He agrees to testify about everything he knows about the Scarfo organization, The murders, the extortions, the structure, the hierarchy, all of it. Caramandi is, by any measure, a devastating witness. He has been inside the Scarfo operation for years. He has personally participated in murders ordered by Scarfo. He knows names, dates, locations, specifics. And he can speak to them not as someone who heard things secondhand, but as a direct participant. Around the same time, Tommy Del Giorno, another of Scarfo's most trusted associates, a capo who ran significant gambling operations and had participated in multiple murders, also flips. Del Giorno makes the same calculation as Caramandi. Scarfo's paranoia is escalating. His own position within the family has become uncertain. The legal exposure is enormous, and the alternative to cooperation is either a long prison sentence or a bullet. Del Giorno's information is even more extensive than Caramandi's. He admits to participation in 5 murders. He agrees to testify not just about the extortion case, but about everything. The full architecture of the Scarfo family's criminal operations over the previous decade. The FBI later says that information from Del Giorno alone helps them solve 24 homicides. The combination of Caramandi and Del Giorno, 2 senior, deeply embedded members of the Scarfo organization who are now cooperating with federal investigators, changes the legal landscape entirely. What had been a complex, circumstantial case against the Philadelphia mob's leadership becomes something far more powerful, a case built on the detailed, first-person testimony of men who were there, who did the things they are describing, and who know the specific facts that only participants would know. Scarfo is arrested at Philadelphia International Airport in 1987, returning from a trip. The charges include conspiracy, racketeering, and extortion of Willard Rouse. A jury convicts him and several co-defendants in May 1987, and he is sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. 14 years. For a man in his 50s, already carrying a substantial criminal record, this is devastating. But Scarfo does not know yet how much worse it is going to get, because the Rouse extortion case is only the beginning. The FBI, energized by the success of that prosecution and armed with the testimony of Caramandi and Del Giorno, is building a much larger case, a RICO case, the case that will define his legacy and end his life as a free man. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's investigation of the Scarfo organization in the mid to late 1980s is one of the most comprehensive organized crime investigations in the Bureau's history. It draws on multiple investigative tools simultaneously: electronic surveillance, physical surveillance, financial investigation, and most crucially, the testimony of cooperating witnesses who provide the interior view that surveillance alone cannot capture. The electronic surveillance operation is extensive. FBI agents plant listening devices in locations where the Scarfo organization conducts its business, not just in obvious places like the Scarf Incorporated Construction Company, but in social clubs, restaurants, and meeting rooms that the family uses for its less formal communications. The wiretaps capture conversations that, when played in court, will leave no ambiguity about the nature of the operation or the identity of its leadership. What the tapes reveal is a criminal organization operating with a specific, hierarchical structure of La Cosa Nostra, a world in which orders flow down from the boss, in which participation in murders requires the approval of the boss, in which the boss's decisions are final and not subject to appeal. This structure, which the mob has always relied on as a shield of deniability, the boss always has an alibi, the boss never touches a trigger, becomes in Scarfo's case a prosecution tool, because the testimony of Caramandi and Del Giorno can speak directly to Scarfo's role in ordering specific crimes. The FBI also has something else going for them: Scarfo's own personality, because a boss who is measured and careful about what he says, who communicates through layers of intermediaries, who never commits anything to writing or to audio, who maintains a disciplined operational security that organized crime relies on, that boss is genuinely difficult to prosecute. But a boss who is impulsive, who talks when he should stay silent, who allows his rage to override his caution, who conducts business with a kind of arrogant indifference to the possibility of surveillance, that boss hands prosecutors their case on a silver platter. Nicodemo Scarfo is the second kind of boss. The tapes capture him discussing murders. The tapes capture him issuing orders. The tapes capture the conversations that surround him with evidence of his direct participation in the criminal enterprise. Combined with the testimony of cooperating witnesses, The surveillance record that the FBI assembles over several years is, by the time the RICO indictment is ready, essentially airtight. In 1987, while already serving the 14-year sentence from the Rouse extortion conviction, Scarfo and 16 associates are indicted under the Federal Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Statute, RICO, on charges that include 9 murders for attempted murders, extortion, loan sharking, gambling, and drug trafficking. The indictment is the culmination of years of investigative work, and it represents the most serious legal challenge that the Philadelphia crime family has ever faced. The defendants include not just Scarfo, but the core of his leadership. Philip Leonetti, still his underboss. Francis Faffy Iannarella. Joseph Joey Punge Pungitor. Salvatore Wayne Grande, the man who pulled the trigger on Salvatore Testa. Lawrence Merlino, Charlie Ionis, and others, 17 defendants in total, charged with being members of a criminal enterprise that has systematically used violence to acquire and maintain criminal power. The scale of the indictment is enormous. The charges encompass virtually the entire operational history of the Scarfo mob from the early 1980s through the time of the arrests. Every murder, every extortion, every act of racketeering that the FBI has been able to document is in the indictment. The prosecution has not tried to pick off peripheral figures while leaving the leadership intact, as it happened in earlier prosecutions of organized crime. The prosecution is going after the entire organization simultaneously. From the top down, Scarfo's legal team mounts a vigorous defense. His attorney, Bobby Simone, is one of the most prominent criminal defense lawyers in Philadelphia, a formidable courtroom presence who has successfully defended Scarfo in multiple previous cases. The defense strategy centers on attacking the credibility of the government's cooperating witnesses. Caramandi and Del Giorno are, by any objective measure, extremely compromised witnesses. They are admitted killers. They are men who have committed the crimes they are testifying about. They have received deals in exchange for their cooperation, deals that reduce their sentences dramatically and place them in witness protection. The defense will argue that these are men who will say anything to save themselves, that their testimony is motivated entirely by self-interest, and that a jury should not send a man to prison for life based on the word of people who have committed murders. It is not an unreasonable argument, and it is the best argument available. But the prosecution's response is equally powerful. Caramandi and Del Giorno are credible not because they are good people, but because they know things that only a participant would know. The specific details of the murders, the specific conversations, the specific locations. These are not things that can be fabricated, and the FBI surveillance corroborates much of what they say. The trial begins on September 28, 1988. It will run for 33 days of testimony. An anonymous jury is seated, the first indication of the judge's concern about witness intimidation, and sequestered. The courtroom is packed for every day of proceedings. The federal courthouse in Philadelphia in the fall of 1988 is a stage for one of the most extraordinary organized crime trials in American history. 17 defendants, 33 days of testimony, a parade of witnesses that includes 2 admitted mob hitmen, multiple FBI agents, financial investigators, and surveillance experts. An anonymous, sequestered jury selected specifically to minimize the risk of intimidation. And at the center of it all, Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo, 59 years old, diminutive, defiant, dressed in expensive suits, looking out at the courtroom with the expression of a man who does not believe this can end badly for him. Scarfo's demeanor throughout the trial is remarkable. He does not project fear. He does not project remorse. He projects contempt for the process, for the witnesses, for the men who have chosen to cooperate against him. When Caramandi and Del Giorno take the stand, Scarfo looks at them with an expression that former courtroom observers describe as a combination of rage and disdain. The look of a man who cannot believe that the men he elevated, the men he trusted, the men he made wealthy, are sitting in a federal courtroom describing his orders in clinical detail. The government's lead prosecutor, Louis Piccini, delivers a closing argument that becomes one of the most quoted passages in the history of organized crime prosecution. He points at Scarfo and says, "There's blood on the hands of all these defendants, but there's one defendant whose hands are drenched with blood. Those are the hands of Nicodemo Scarfo." He calls Scarfo a cold-blooded, paranoid killer, and a throwback to gangsters of yesteryear, who recruited an army of disciples to operate his criminal empire, whose first commandment was submission. Submission to the boss, following which meant betraying close associates, a best friend, and even family, surrendering your very soul to the mob. Piccini described the men around Scarfo as mob disciples who worshipped an altar, and the centerpiece of that altar was violence and greed. The defense argues back with everything it has. Bobby Simone attacks the credibility of Caramandi and Del Giorno with ferocity. Thomas Del Giorno's own son takes a stand as a defense witness, claiming that his father's testimony was coerced and fabricated by FBI agents eager to nail Scarfo. Though under prosecution cross-examination, the son admits that he wishes he could return to Philadelphia, but cannot out of fear. None of it is enough. On November 17, 1988, after a few days of deliberation, the jury returns its verdict. Guilty on all counts. Guilty for Scarfo. Guilty for all 17 defendants. The jury has convicted the entire leadership structure of the Philadelphia crime family on all charges. Scarfo is convicted on 32 counts of racketeering, including 8 counts of murder, for count of attempted murder, multiple count of extortion, 2 counts of methamphetamine distribution, loan sharking, and illegal gambling. The verdict is comprehensive and devastating. The sentencing follows in May 1989. Scarfo receives 55 years in federal prison. At the time of sentencing, the judge notes that this is effectively a life sentence for a man of Scarfo's age. He also notes that Scarfo becomes the first La Cosa Nostra boss in American history to be personally convicted of murder, specifically the murder of Frank D'Alfonso, for which he receives a separate life sentence in a state court proceeding, a sentence that is later overturned on appeal, but which at the time adds to the already overwhelming total of prison time he faces. In the courtroom, as the sentence is handed down, Scarfo shrugs. Just shrugs. As if 55 years in federal prison is a minor inconvenience, a temporary setback, something that a man of his resources and connections can manage and eventually overcome. It is possible that in this moment, Nicodemo Scarfo genuinely believes that he will not serve the full sentence, that appeals will work, that his lawyers will find a way, that the same fortune that has kept him alive through multiple assassination attempts and multiple previous criminal prosecutions will continue to protect him. Or perhaps the shrug is a last act of a man who has built his entire life around projection of fearlessness, and who cannot, even now, in the worst moment of his life, allow himself to show weakness to the world. Either way, the shrug becomes iconic. The image of Nicodemo Scarfo shrugging in the face of a 55-year sentence is one of the defining images of American organized crime in the 20th century. A man so committed to a particular performance of toughness that even the destruction of his freedom cannot penetrate it. Even as Scarfo is being processed into the federal prison system, even as his co-defendants are being led away to begin serving their sentences, the worst blow is still coming. The blow that will define his legacy more completely than any of the others. The blow that will make his story not just a story of violence and greed, but of something deeper and more universal. The profound, devastating cost of being a man who trusts nobody. Philip Leonetti. For 25 years, Philip Leonetti has been at Nicodemo Scarfo's side. Since boyhood, since the days in Atlantic City when it was just the two of them building something out of nothing, since the murders and the wars and the rise and the empire, Leonetti has been there. He has killed for his uncle. He has protected him. He has been his underboss, the second most powerful man in the Philadelphia mob, a man so capable and so trusted that at 31 he becomes the youngest underboss in the history of the American Mafia. Leonetti is, in every sense that matters, Scarfo's closest ally, his blood, his family, the one person who, by every logic available, should be the last person to break. But Philip Leonetti has watched what his uncle's paranoia has done. He has watched Salvatore Testa, a man he has known since childhood, a man he has fought beside, a man he has considered a brother, be lured to a candy store and shot in the back of the head by his own best friend. Leonetti has seen what happens to loyalty in Nicodemo Scarfo's world. He has seen that loyalty is not protection. He has seen that the code of La Cosa Nostra, the sacred oath that was burned into his consciousness at his initiation, means nothing to the man who asked him to take it. In a conversation that Leonetti later describes in detail, Scarfo tells him repeatedly, "You've got to kill people, and you got to keep on killing them. That's how this thing works." And Leonetti comes to a realization that takes years to form, but when it comes is complete and irrevocable. The version of La Cosa Nostra that his uncle practices has no rules, no brotherhood, no code. It is simply a mechanism for one man's terror, and Leonetti is both its instrument and its potential next victim. In 1989, after his RICO conviction and his sentence of 45 years in federal prison, Philip Leonetti makes a decision. He tells the FBI he will cooperate. He will testify. He will say everything. The revelation, when it becomes public, rocks the American mob world to its foundations. At the time he flips, Leonetti is the highest-ranking member of La Cosa Nostra ever to become a government witness. This is not a street soldier or a low-level associate making a deal. This is the underboss. This is the number 2 man in the entire Philadelphia crime family. This is Nicodemo Scarfo's own nephew, the man who has been by his side for a quarter of a century, the man who killed Vincent Falcone on his uncle's order back in 1979 and never once wavered. Leonetti admits to participating in 10 murders. He provides the FBI and federal prosecutors with an interior view of the Scarfo organization that is more detailed, more authoritative, and more damaging than anything Caramandi or Del Giorno had provided. He describes not just the organizational structure and the specific crimes, but the decision-making process, the conversations, the personality of the boss, the specific, personal way in which Nicodemo Scarfo ordered people killed, the pleasure he took in it, the paranoia that drove it. Leonetti's testimony does not just seal Scarfo's fate. Scarfo is already convicted and sentenced by the time Leonetti officially cooperates. What it does is extend the damage far beyond Philadelphia, because Leonetti knows things about the broader American Mafia that are not limited to the Philadelphia family. He knows about the 5 families in New York. He has met with John Gotti. He has dealt with Vincent, the Cingigani of the Genovese family. His testimony ultimately contributes to convictions of high-ranking members of multiple crime families up and down the East Coast, a reverberating damage that extends years beyond his own case. The deal Leonetti receives from the government is, by any ordinary standard, extraordinary. He serves just 5 years, 5 months, and 5 days in federal prison in exchange for his cooperation. 5 years for 10 murders and a career of organized crime. It is, by any objective measure, a remarkable transaction, one that reflects the value of what he provides to the government, but one that also speaks to the price of betrayal in the mob world. Scarfo, learning of his nephew's decision from behind prison walls, reportedly places a contract on Leonetti's life, a reported $500,000 price on the head of the man who was once his most trusted associate. That contract remained, by all accounts, active for decades. After his release from prison, Leonetti enters the witness security program. He builds a new life under a new identity in a location that remains secret. He gets married, remarkably, to the former girlfriend of Vincent Falcone, the man he murdered in 1979 on his uncle's orders. He becomes a successful businessman. In 2013, he publishes a book, Mafia Prince, Inside America's Most Violent Crime Family and the Bloody Fall of La Cosa Nostra. It is a devastating account of life inside the Scarfo mob, written from the perspective of the man who was closest to the center of it. Leonetti describes his uncle in the book as a satanic despot who ruined his life and the lives of everyone around him. He says that when his uncle took over, there was no more brotherhood, no rules, no code, just an escalating cycle of violence and paranoia that consumed everything and everyone. While Nicodemo Scarfo is navigating the legal catastrophe of his prosecution and conviction, the destruction he has set in motion reaches beyond the mob and into his own bloodline. His 3 sons, Chris, Nicodemo Jr., and Mark, each carry the weight of their father's legacy, and each is devastated by it in a different way. The oldest son, Christopher, takes the most radical escape route available to him. He legally changes his name, adopting his wife's maiden name, attempting to put as much distance as possible between himself and the Scarfo identity. He wants nothing to do with the mob, nothing to do with his father's world, and he takes a pragmatic, painful step of erasing his surname to make that separation as clear as possible. He disappears from the public record, living quietly under a different name, trying to build a life that is not defined by what his father is. The youngest son, Mark, is 16 or 17 years old when his father's RICO trial begins in the fall of 1988. He has grown up in the shadow of his father's infamy. His classmates have taunted him for years about who his father is, what his father does, what his father has been accused of. He has been the son of the mob boss at school, a status that brings no protection and considerable cruelty from kids who are both afraid of the name and contemptuous of the boy who carries it. On November 1st, 1988, just 3 days before his brother Nicky Jr. is arrested for assaulting a woman at a hospital, Mark Scarfo hangs himself in the office of his father's concrete company in Atlantic City. His mother finds him. Paramedics respond and manage to resuscitate him, but the oxygen deprivation is severe. Mark suffers cardiac arrest. He enters a coma. He does not come out of that coma for nearly 25 years. He lives in a persistent vegetative state, somewhere between life and death, for a quarter of a century, a living testament to collateral damage of his father's choices. Mark Scarfo dies in April 2014, never having recovered consciousness after that November night in 1988. The middle son, Nicodemo Jr., Nicky Scarfo Jr., chooses a path that his father has walked because it is the only path he knows. He tries to maintain his father's influence in the Philadelphia underworld after the elder Scarfo's imprisonment, serving as a conduit for his father's orders from behind bars, a proxy through whom the imprisoned boss attempts to continue controlling his organization. The Philadelphia family does not welcome this arrangement. By 1989, Scarfo's regime has been effectively dismantled by the RICO convictions. The men who might have followed his orders are in prison or in witness protection. New figures are emerging. Most significantly, Joey Merlino, a younger generation mob figure who has no particular interest in serving as a surrogate for an imprisoned boss thousands of miles away. On Halloween night 1989, Nicky Scarfo Jr. is dining at Dante and Luigi's, an Italian restaurant in Philadelphia, one of the most storied neighborhood restaurants in South Philadelphia, a place so deeply embedded in Italian-American culture that to be shot, there's almost a statement about the death of the world that produced this story. A gunman in a Batman mask enters the restaurant. He opens fire on Nicky Scarfo Jr. from close range. 9 bullets. 6 actually hit Nicky Jr. in various parts of his body. By some extraordinary physical luck, none of the 6 bullets strikes a vital organ. He survives. The gunman flees. The assassination attempt is understood in Philadelphia as a message to the senior Scarfo that his ability to reach into the city from his prison cell is over. The new generation of Philadelphia mob figures is declaring independence. They are not going to be managed by a man in a federal penitentiary who cannot protect his own son. It later emerges, through testimony in subsequent legal proceedings, that Joey Merlino himself may have been the gunman in the Batman mask. Multiple witnesses, including Ralph Natale, who later becomes a government witness himself, testify that Merlino admitted to the shooting while they were serving time together. Merlino has always denied it. Nicky Scarfo Jr., surviving the assassination attempt, is subsequently placed under protection of the Lucchese crime family in New York, arranged through his father's friendship with Lucchese boss Viccamuso. He is formally inducted into the Lucchese family, becoming a made member of a New York organization rather than the Philadelphia family his father led. He rises within the Lucchese structure to become a capo overseeing the family's New Jersey operations. He is arrested multiple times over the subsequent decades, convicted on gambling and fraud charges repeatedly. In 2015, he is sentenced to 30 years in federal prison for racketeering conspiracy, illegal gambling, and securities fraud, adding another generation of Scarfo family imprisonment to the already extraordinary catalog. The 3 sons of Nicodemo Scarfo, one who fled his name, one who died after a quarter century in a coma, and one who followed his father into federal prison system. This is the inheritance that little Nicky left his children. This is a legacy of his empire inside the federal prison system. Nicodemo Scarfo does not become a man of reflection or remorse. He does not, as far as any available record suggests, spend his years behind bars examining his choices or acknowledging the devastation he has caused. He is, inside the prison, the same man he was outside of it, imperious, paranoid, convinced of his own authority, incapable of accepting diminishment. He begins serving his federal sentence at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, one of the most secure facilities in the system. He is not, despite his age and his years in the legal system, treated as a harmless old man by prison authorities. He is classified as a significant security risk, a man with the connections, the resources, and the disposition to continue attempting to exercise criminal influence even from behind bars. His attempts to do exactly that are documented in the period immediately following his 1989 imprisonment. He communicates through his lawyers, through family members, through the small network of allies who have not yet been imprisoned or turned. He tries to issue orders to what remains of the Philadelphia family. He pushes his son Nicky Jr. to serve as his proxy on the streets, which leads directly to the Halloween shooting. But the reality of his situation asserts itself quickly and brutally. The organization he spent a decade building has been gutted. The men he trusted are either in prison alongside him, in witness protection testifying against him, or dead. The New York Commission, which once endorsed him and provided him with the legitimacy that comes from being recognized by the national organized crime structure, has moved on. John Gotti is consumed by his own problems. The Genovese family, which had been the Philadelphia family's most important New York ally, wants nothing to do with the liability that the Scarfo name now represents. Philadelphia itself is changing. The generation of mob figures that emerged in the vacuum left by the Scarfo convictions, Joey Merlino's group, which will eventually become its own story of violence and prosecution, has no particular loyalty to the imprisoned boss. They see themselves as successors, not servants. The city moves on. The mob moves on. What remains for Scarfo is the prison itself. Decades of it. The daily reality of institutional life for a man who spent his years on the outside in expensive restaurants, fur coats, and million-dollar extortions. He is not entirely passive. Through the 1990s, he maintains connections, some through family, some through the Lucchese family's relationship with his son. He follows from a distance the ongoing chaos of the Philadelphia mob, the rise of Merlino, the further convictions, the endless prosecutorial attention that continues to focus on organized crime in the city. He knows the names of the men who have replaced him, the men who have benefited from the vacuum he left, and his feelings about them are, by all accounts, extremely negative. The FBI, aware of Scarfo's continued appetite for criminal involvement even from prison, continues to monitor his communications. His phone calls from prison are recorded. His correspondence is reviewed. The picture that emerges is of a man who has not made peace with the situation and who has not abandoned the identity and the worldview that put him in prison in the first place. And then, in 2001, something extraordinary happens. Something that demonstrates, more vividly than almost anything else in his story, the absolute intractability of Nicodemo Scarfo's criminal character. By the late 1990s, while Nicodemo Scarfo is sitting in federal prison serving his 55-year sentence, his son Nicky Jr. is embedded in the Lucchese crime family's operations in New Jersey. And the operation that Nicky Jr. is running, the operation that is generating significant money for the Lucchese family and for the Scarfo family through him, is not the traditional mob racket of gambling or loan sharking or construction extortion. It is securities fraud, stock manipulation, the kind of criminality that had, in the 1990s, found an unexpected new home in the world of organized crime. The boiler room, where brokers cold call small investors and push them into worthless stocks, manipulating prices and dumping shares at artificial highs while investors are left holding worthless paper. The specific vehicle is a Texas-based mortgage financing company called First Plus Financial Group. The company had been active in the mortgage industry, had gone mostly dormant in the late 1990s during a financial downturn, and then suddenly became active again in the mid-2000s in a way that drew immediate federal attention. The company was being used, investigators discover, as a vehicle for large-scale financial fraud, with mob connections on both the Lucchese side, and through Nicky Jr. reaching back to the imprisoned Nicodemo Scarfo Sr. The FBI investigation into the First Plus matter leads to a 2001 federal indictment charging Nicodemo Scarfo Sr., while serving his original 55-year sentence, as a participant in the fraud scheme. The charge is that even from his prison cell, Scarfo has been involved in a securities fraud and racketeering operation that has generated millions of dollars. He receives an additional sentence of 30 years to run consecutively with his existing 55-year term. He is now, in official terms, serving 85 years in federal prison. He will never be free again. The reaction from those who have watched his career is something between incredulity and dark admiration. This is a man in his 70s, already serving a sentence that will never end, who has managed to involve himself in a completely different category of crime from behind bars, moving from old-school organized crime extortion into the financial crime of the 1990s, adapting his criminal instincts to new environments even from a prison cell. It speaks to something fundamental about Nicodemo Scarfo's character: the inability to stop, the inability to recognize or accept defeat, the inability to say, even at this stage of his life, even in these circumstances, that is over and be done with it. This is the essence of who he is. Not a calculating criminal strategist, not a pragmatist who recognized when the game was lost and made his peace with it, but a man driven by something deeper than strategy, by need. The need for power, for control, for the feeling of consequence that comes from being someone who can make things happen, who can reach into the world and shape it, even if the world he can now reach is the narrow world of a prison yard and a phone call. To understand the full scope of what Nicodemo Scarfo destroyed, it is necessary to look at what the Philadelphia mob became in his absence, because the story of the Philadelphia crime family after Scarfo is not a story of recovery or rebuilding. It is a story of an organization so thoroughly gutted by his violence and his paranoia that it never again approaches the power, the stability, or the coherence of what Angelo Bruno built. In the immediate aftermath of the 1988 to 1989 RICO convictions, the Philadelphia family essentially has no functioning leadership. The boss is in prison. The underboss is cooperating with the government. Most of the captains are either in prison or dead or in witness protection. The soldiers are uncertain who to report to, who is in charge, whether the family even still exists in any meaningful sense. Various figures attempt to fill the vacuum over the next several years, each with limited success and most with eventual legal consequences. John Stanfa, a Sicilian-born mobster with connections to the original Bruno era, is brought in with commission backing in the early 1990s. But his tenure is marred by a vicious war with the emerging Merlino faction and his eventual RICO conviction in 1995. Joey Merlino, the son of Salvatore Chucky Merlino, the underboss who Scarfo himself had demoted after the killing of Salvatore Testa, becomes a dominant figure in Philadelphia organized crime in the mid to late 1990s. Merlino is young, charismatic, and genuinely popular in South Philadelphia in a way that recalls Salvi Testa's earlier popularity. He brings some stability to what remains of the organization. But even Merlino cannot escape the trajectory that Scarfo established. The FBI's relentless focus on Philadelphia organized crime does not abate. Merlino was convicted in 2001 on federal racketeering charges, serving time before being released and later facing additional charges. The prosecutorial machinery that was fully deployed against the Scarfo organization continues to grind through successor generations. The Philadelphia mob of the 2000s and beyond is, by every available measure, a shadow of what it once was. The Atlantic City empire that Scarfo built during the casino boom of the 1980s, the concrete companies, the union connections, the political corruption, the systematic extortion of construction projects, has been dismantled by prosecution and by the broader changes in Atlantic City's economy. The casinos that his men bled and died to infiltrate eventually faced their own decline, many of them closing as Atlantic City struggles to compete with casinos in neighboring states. The territory that the Philadelphia family once commanded, an empire that stretched from the Italian neighborhoods of South Philadelphia through the casino boardwalk of Atlantic City and into the suburban sprawl of South Jersey, has contracted to a fraction of its former size. The money is smaller. The fear that once kept people in line has dissipated. The generation of men who knew Scarfo personally, who understood what he was capable of, who worked within the structures he built, most of them are dead, imprisoned, or living under new identities. What Angelo Bruno spent 21 years constructing, Nicodemo Scarfo spent 9 years destroying. The contrast is not subtle. It is the difference between an organization that understood its own interests and one that was consumed by a single man's pathology. The years passed slowly in federal prison, decades of them. Nicodemo Scarfo, who entered the federal prison system in 1989 as a 59-year-old man, at the peak of his infamy, ages inside the system without the mercy of early release or successful appeal. His legal team continues to fight. Multiple appeals are filed over the years following his convictions. Some achieve partial victories. The separate life sentence for the murder of Frank D'Alfonso, handed down in state court, is eventually overturned on appeal, a legal victory, but one that has no practical effect on the situation, given the 55 years already owed to the federal government. The Wall Street case adds 30 years and ends any realistic possibility of release. In the mid-2000s, Scarfo is transferred to the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina, a federal facility that handles prisoners with significant medical needs. His health is declining. He has been in custody for nearly 2 decades. He is aging visibly, the ferocity of his manner softening not into gentleness, but into a kind of diminished, bitter endurance. He reads. He follows the news. He follows what remains of the Philadelphia mob's activities through whatever channels are available to him. Newspaper reports, information passed through family visits and phone calls, the general background noise of the world outside his cell. He knows about Joey Merlino's wars and legal troubles. He knows about the collapse of the family he led. He knows about the casinos on the boardwalk that are closing one by one as Atlantic City's economic decline accelerates. He knows about his nephew Philip Leonetti's book, Mafia Prince, published in 2013, is available in bookstores and online. In it, Leonetti describes Scarfo in terms that are not flattering. As a man whose paranoia and cruelty made the mob worse in every way, as a man who broke all the rules he claimed to honor, as a man whose violence served no purpose beyond the satisfaction of his own pathological needs. When asked in an interview what he thinks Scarfo will do when he reads a book, Leonetti says he imagines Scarfo will curse it, deny it, say it is all lies. The people who visit Scarfo in prison during these final years find him physically diminished but mentally sharp, still interested in the world, still capable of the withering assessment of character that he always delivered, still unable to fully accept the magnitude of what has happened to him and what he has done. There are accounts of him receiving visitors and speaking about the men who betrayed him with a venom that has not faded with the decades. Caramandi, Del Giorno, Leonetti. These names carry a specific weight in his vocabulary that never lightens. He thinks about what might have been. Or perhaps he doesn't. Perhaps that is the wrong template for understanding a man like Nicodemo Scarfo, who was never constitutionally given to introspection or regret. Perhaps what he thinks about in the long hours of those final years is not what he might have done differently, but who wronged him. Because in Scarfo's worldview, his downfall is not the result of his own choices. It is a result of rats and cowards and weak men who could not hold their loyalty under pressure. He never sees it differently. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the entire story. After everything, after 30 years in prison, after the death of his sons, after the destruction of his family and his empire, Nicodemo Scarfo does not become a different man. He remains who he has always been. Small, implacable, unwilling to yield. And then, on January 13, 2017, at the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina, Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo dies of cancer. He is 87 years old. He has been in federal custody for 28 years. He dies as he has lived for the final 3 decades of his life, alone, inside a cage, surrounded by enemies. When Nicodemo Scarfo dies, the law enforcement agencies that spent a decade bringing him to justice offer assessments that are notable for their uniformity. The FBI, the Justice Department, the Philadelphia Police Department, the New Jersey State Police, they all say essentially the same thing about him. He was one of the most violent organized crime figures in American history, and his career represents a case study in how a criminal organization can be destroyed from within by the pathology of its own leadership. The statistics of his tenure as boss, assembled over years of investigation and prosecution, are staggering. During the 9 years of his leadership of the Philadelphia crime family, from 1981 to 1990, approximately 30 people were murdered, most of them on his direct orders. Nearly 24 more were indicted and imprisoned as a result of the investigations that his violence and mismanagement provoked. An entire generation of potential leaders in the Philadelphia underworld was wiped out. George Anastasia, the Philadelphia Inquirer reporter who covered the Scarfo mob for years and wrote the definitive account, Blood and Honor, Inside the Scarfo Mob, describes him as a man whose cruelty was not purely tactical but pathological, A man who used violence not just to achieve ends, but as an expression of his own need for dominance, for the constant reassurance that he was the most dangerous person in the room. The Philadelphia Daily News once called him the undersized Atlantic City man with the oversized temper, Anastasia writes, and the characterization captures something essential about how Scarfo's psychology shaped his actions. Former mob reporter and crime author George Anastasia, who covered the Philadelphia mob for decades, has written extensively about how Bruno's organization operated on discipline and professionalism, while Scarfo's operated on terror. The transition from one to the other is not just a change in management style. It is a fundamental transformation of what the organization is, what it exists to do, and how it relates to its own members. Under Bruno, the family was a criminal enterprise. Under Scarfo, it was a machine for generating and distributing fear, with criminal revenue as a byproduct. The federal prosecutor who secured Scarfo's RICO conviction, Louis Piccini, says in post-trial assessments that Scarfo's case represents everything that RICO was designed to prosecute, not just individual crimes, but the pattern of racketeering activity that constitutes an ongoing criminal enterprise. The case against Scarfo was not just about specific murders or extortions. It was about the enterprise itself and about the specific individual, Scarfo, who controlled it, directed it, and bore responsibility for everything it did. The legal legacy of the case is substantial. Scarfo's prosecution was one of a series of major RICO prosecutions in the 1980s, including the prosecution of the New York Five families that ended with multiple convictions in 1986 that permanently altered the legal landscape around organized crime. The willingness to use RICO, to build cases around patterns of criminal enterprise rather than individual acts, to flip high-ranking members and use their testimony to take down entire organizations. These prosecutorial strategies were refined through cases like Scarfo's and applied with devastating effect across the American Mafia throughout the late 1980s and 1990s. Scarfo becomes, in the analytical literature of organized crime, something of a cautionary archetype, the boss whose psychological instability destroyed what rational management might have preserved. Compared to contemporaries like Paul Castellano, the Gambino family boss who ran a sophisticated criminal enterprise through careful management before his murder by John Gotti, or even figures like Gotti himself, whose flamboyance and recklessness ultimately brought him down. Scarfo occupies a unique category. He is not simply reckless. He is driven by needs that transcend rational calculation, by a psychology that cannot be satisfied by money or power alone, but requires the constant demonstration that he can take life without consequence. That psychology, ultimately, is what makes a story both fascinating and deeply human, because the pathology that destroyed Nicodemo Scarfo is recognizable, in distorted extreme form, as the pathology of insecurity, of the need for control, of the fear of diminishment that haunts people who have been made to feel small. He was called little his whole life. He was sent away like a child being punished. He spent 17 years in what was supposed to be his irrelevance. And when he finally got power, he could not hold it gently. He could only grip it until everything around him broke. Walk the Atlantic City boardwalk today, and what you see is a city in ongoing recovery from its second great decline. The casinos that rose in the 1980s, those billion-dollar towers that were built on the bones of Scarfo's violence and extortion, have largely closed or been converted. The Taj Mahal is a memory. The Atlantic Club, the Showboat, the Revel, all gone. The boardwalk itself, which in the early 1980s was the center of the most lucrative criminal enterprise on the East Coast, is quieter now, more modest, a place of old glory and uncertain future. The construction cranes that Scarfo's men watched with such covetous eyes in the late 1970s and early 1980s are a different kind of crane now. The city is always, it seems, being rebuilt, trying new things, attempting another resurrection. But the families that built those original towers, the contractors who paid their tributes to Scarfo's organization, have long since moved on. The unions that Scarfo infiltrated have been cleaned up, reorganized, placed under federal oversight in some cases following the prosecutions of the 1980s and 1990s. The Ducktown neighborhood, the Italian-American enclave of Atlantic City, where Scarfo's mother ran her boarding house, where Nicky Jr. grew up, where the seeds of the Atlantic City empire were planted in the years of exile, is a different place now. The community it housed is dispersed, as urban Italian-American communities have across the country, absorbed into broader American suburban culture in ways that make them almost unrecognizable. The specific addresses where Scarfo's organization operated, the social clubs, the construction company offices, the homes where meetings were held and orders were given, are mostly unremarkable buildings today, holding no visible trace of what happened inside them. The blood has been painted over. The bodies have been buried for decades. The conversations captured on FBI tapes are now evidence in closed legal files, listened to by researchers and journalists and true crime enthusiasts who study this period, but no longer part of the living reality of the city. Philadelphia, too, has moved on. South Philadelphia is still South Philadelphia, still the dense, Italian-American-rooted neighborhood that produced the Bruno crime family and the Scarfo mob and generations of organized crime before both. But the specific world that those organizations operated in, the world of neighborhood loyalty, of old country codes, of men who kept their mouths shut because silence was both cultural preference and self-preservation, that world has been replaced by something more diffuse, more modern, more exposed to the scrutiny of surveillance and prosecution that the Mafia of the classic era never had to fully reckon with. The Philadelphia crime family continues to exist in a reduced and legally compromised form. It is a fraction of what it was. It no longer commands the political relationships, the union infiltration, or the financial scale of the Scarfo era, let alone the Bruno era before it. The prosecutorial infrastructure built in the 1980s, the FBI field office that developed expertise in RICO prosecutions, the state and federal prosecutors who built careers on organized crime cases, has never fully stood down, and the Philadelphia mob that remains knows it. Angelo Bruno's grave is in Holy Cross Cemetery in Yeadon, Pennsylvania. So is Philip Testa's. So is Salvatore Testa's, buried alongside his father and his mother, 3 generations of one family consumed by the organization they served. Frank D'Alfonso is buried somewhere in Philadelphia. Judge Edwin Helfand, murdered in a restaurant for refusing a bribe, is somewhere in South Jersey. Vincent Falcone, killed because he called a man little, is buried and mostly forgotten. Nicodemo Scarfo's grave is in a federal prison. Or rather, he was buried after his death in January 2017 in a location that, like so much about the final chapter of his story, is not the subject of public record. He died in the Federal Medical Center. His passing was noted by mob journalists and true crime researchers, most of whom have been tracking his case for decades. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran an obituary. The New York Times ran a brief notice. Various websites dedicated to organized crime history offered retrospectives. The response from law enforcement was largely silent. Men like Nicodemo Scarfo do not receive eulogies from the agencies that pursued them. They do not receive acknowledgement that their passing represents any kind of loss. They simply stop, and the world moves on, and the empty space they leave fills in around them as though they were never there. To simply catalog the crimes of Nicodemo Scarfo is to miss something important. The thing that makes a story not just a history lesson about organized crime, but a genuinely illuminating exploration of what happens when a certain kind of human psychology achieves power. Scarfo is not unique in history. The specific combination of traits he exhibits, the pathological insecurity expressed through domination, the extreme sensitivity to perceived disrespect, the paranoia that cannot be assuaged by reassurance, but only by the elimination of those who might pose a threat, is a recognizable pattern that appears in leaders at every scale, from neighborhood gangs to national governments. What makes Scarfo interesting is the clarity with which his story illustrates the consequences of this pattern when placed inside a specific institution with specific rules and capabilities. The Mafia, at its functional best, is a remarkably rational institution. It has hierarchy, rules, a code of conduct, clear mechanisms for resolution of disputes, and understood consequences for violations. The bosses who made it work, who made it endure for decades while law enforcement tried to dismantle it, were generally men who understood the institution's needs and subordinated their personal desires to those needs. Bruno is the exemplar. He wanted peace not because he was gentle, but because peace was profitable and profit was the point. Scarfo represents the opposite. A man who cannot subordinate himself to any institution, even one he controls. His ego, his insecurities, his pathological need for absolute dominance, These things are not manageable within the framework of a rational criminal enterprise because they are not rational. They are psychological drives that override calculation, that override self-interest, that eventually override even self-preservation. Philip Leonetti captures this in his account better than any outside observer could. He was very, very paranoid. He betrayed himself. The insight is precise. Scarfo's downfall is not primarily external. Not the FBI, not the RICO statute, not the informants who testified against him. His downfall is internal. He creates the conditions for his own destruction by being the kind of boss who forces his own men into the position of choosing between certain death and the FBI. He gives them no middle option. And when enough of them choose the FBI, he has no defense. The specific mechanics of his psychological makeup are visible throughout his story. The stabbing over a booth in 1963 is not the act of a calculating criminal making a tactical decision. It is the act of a man who cannot tolerate being told no, who cannot accept being in any situation where someone else has something he believes should be his, who responds to that intolerable situation with the most direct and violent means available. The murder of Falcone for calling him a little guy is the same mechanism, escalated. The murder of Judge Helfand for refusing a bribe is the same mechanism, escalated further. By the time he is ordering the murder of his most loyal soldier for being too popular, the mechanism has consumed all judgment, all restraint, all ability to distinguish between threats and non-threats. The men around him see it. Del Giorno sees it. Caramandi sees it. Leonetti sees it. And Leonetti, who has known Scarfo his whole life, who has understood and accepted the violence because that was the only world he knew, eventually sees it clearly enough to make the most consequential decision of his life. He describes a moment he reaches his breaking point with precision. There was no more brotherhood. My uncle took over, and the way he was acting, it wasn't the same. He was breaking all the rules that he taught me to obey. And I was disgusted. Disgust. Not calculation. Not fear alone. Not the simple arithmetic of prison time. Disgust. Leonetti is disgusted by what his uncle has become, by the way that the institution he grew up inside has been perverted into something unrecognizable. The code of La Cosa Nostra, with all of its genuine brutality, with all of its genuine evil, had a structure, had rules, had a logic. Scarfo's version has none of those things. It is only Scarfo, and Leonetti makes his choice. One of the most frequently discussed aspects of the Scarfo era is the extraordinary number of his own men who ultimately cooperated with the government. By the time the legal proceedings against his organization had run their course, the list of cooperating witnesses against Scarfo and his associates included Nicholas Caramandi, Thomas Del Giorno, Philip Leonetti, Lawrence Yogi Merlino, and eventually many others. For a criminal organization built on the principle of omerta, the sacred code of silence, this cascade of cooperation is almost unprecedented. The casual interpretation of these cooperators is the one that Scarfo himself would have endorsed. They are rats, cowards, men without honor who chose their own skin over their obligations. This interpretation is common in mob culture and in the popular portrayal of organized crime. But the more careful interpretation, the one that the evidence supports, is different. These are men who were placed in an impossible situation by their own boss. Omerta, the code of silence, is not simply a cultural preference. It is a calculated, rational strategy that depends on a specific social contract. You keep silent, you remain loyal, and the organization protects you. The organization uses its resources to defend its members when they are legally compromised. It honors the loyalty it demands. But in Nicodemo Scarfo's organization, this contract is systematically violated. Scarfo does not honor loyalty. He murders his most loyal soldier. He turns on men arbitrarily, without warning, without cause. He creates an environment in which loyalty is not protective, in which, as multiple witnesses testified, you could be targeted for death simply because you were too good at your job, because someone disliked you, because the boss heard something in a conversation that he interpreted as disrespect. When the social contract is broken so completely, the rational incentive to honor omerta disappears. A man who faces a long prison sentence and believes, based on the example of Salvi Testa, that his loyalty will not protect him has a very different calculation to make than a man in a functional criminal organization where loyalty is genuinely rewarded and protected. For men in Scarfo's organization, cooperation with the government is not just about avoiding prison. It is, for some of them, about staying alive. Caramandy says it explicitly in describing his own decision. He flipped in part because he believed Scarfo was planning to have him killed. Del Giorno says the same thing. Leonetti describes a broader disillusionment that encompasses both the fear and the deeper moral revulsion at what Scarfo's leadership had become. The irony at the heart of the story is profound. Nicodemo Scarfo built an organization based on fear, believing that fear was a more reliable foundation than loyalty, that violence was a better tool than trust. And the result of this belief, the predictable, logical result, is that every man in his organization was privately calculating his own survival at every moment, because no one could trust that Scarfo's goodwill would endure. When the government offered them an alternative, many of them took it, not because they were uniquely cowardly or disloyal, but because the alternative, remaining in an organization where the boss might order your death on a whim, was not a rational choice for anyone except a man with no other options. Scarfo trusted nobody, and because he trusted nobody, he gave nobody reason to be trustworthy. He received from his men exactly what he deserved: betrayal at scale. In the long history of American organized crime, Nicodemo Scarfo occupies a specific and somewhat unique position. He is not the most powerful mob boss in American history. That distinction belongs to figures like Lucky Luciano, who literally built the modern Mafia, or Carlo Gambino, who at his peak controlled an organization that spanned New York in ways the Philadelphia family never could. He is not the most famous. John Gotti's dapper public persona made him a media phenomenon that Scarfo, with his Atlantic City exile and his small city power base, never achieved. What Scarfo is, in the judgment of both law enforcement and criminal history, is probably the most personally violent boss of the modern era. The number of murders directly ordered by or attributable to the specific decisions of Nicodemo Scarfo during his tenure as boss, approximately 30 by conservative FBI estimates, is extraordinary for a man who led a regional crime family rather than one of the great New York organizations. Compare him to Bruno, who preceded him. In 21 years of leadership, Bruno ordered a handful of murders, each a carefully considered last resort. In 9 years of leadership, Scarfo ordered approximately 30, many of them driven by personal pique, paranoia, or the kind of rivalry and resentment that more prudent bosses resolve through other means. Compare him to Gotti, who in many ways is the most obvious point of comparison. Both men were flashy where they should have been quiet. Both were given to violence where discretion would have served them better. Both were ultimately undone by informants who cooperated with the government. But Gotti's violence was largely strategic. Gotti murdered Paul Castellano to take the Gambino family, which is a rational, if dangerous, move within mob politics. Gotti's broader management of the Gambino family, for all its problems, was not characterized by the random, paranoid slaughter of loyal subordinates that defined Scarfo's tenure. The closest parallel is not within the American Mafia at all, but in the history of authoritarian political leadership more broadly. The pattern of the leader who survives by eliminating potential rivals, who eventually eliminates anyone with enough capability to threaten him, and who ends up ruling over an organization so hollowed out by purges that it cannot function effectively. Stalin is the extreme example. The mob parallel is Scarfo. The FBI's formal assessment, articulated by agents who worked the Philadelphia case for years, is that Scarfo represents a cautionary example of what happens when criminal organizations fail to maintain the basic internal disciplines that make them viable. Violence is not just morally wrong. In the framework of criminal enterprise, excessive, undisciplined violence is strategically disastrous. It provokes law enforcement. It pushes men into cooperation. It eliminates the very talent that makes the organization profitable and capable. It is ultimately self-defeating. Scarfo knew only one response to problems: elimination. He could not negotiate, could not compromise, could not tolerate ambiguity or inconvenience. And that singularity of approach, that complete inability to adapt or moderate, is what makes a story not just a history of crime, but a psychological study with lessons that extend far beyond the specific world of organized crime. Every major figure in this story has their own story, a full human life lived in the shadow of Nicodemo Scarfo's decisions. To fully understand what he did to the world around him, it is worth following some of those lives to their conclusions. Nicky Caramandy, The hitman who became the government's first major weapon against Scarfo enters the witness security program after his cooperation is complete. He is relocated under a new identity, given a new life in a new place. He writes a book about his time in the Scarfo mob. He speaks publicly about the organization in ways that would have been unthinkable inside it. He lives out his days as a kind of public figure that only the American witness protection system creates. A man who committed murders and served minimal time because his knowledge was more valuable to government than his punishment. Tommy Del Giorno, follows a similar path. His cooperation is instrumental in solving 24 homicides. He serves a reduced sentence, enters protection, starts over. His son testifies against him during the Scarfo trial. A moment of extraordinary dysfunction that says everything about the human wreckage left by a criminal career in the Scarfo era. Philip Leonetti, the nephew who was the underboss, the man who was closest to Scarfo, the highest-ranking Mafia figure ever to flip, serves 5 years, 5 months, and 5 days in federal prison and walks out. He builds a new life. He runs a successful business. He writes a book. He gives interviews. He speaks plainly about what the mob was, what it cost him, and what he would tell young men who think the life looks attractive from the outside. His message is consistent and unambiguous. It is a road to nowhere. It looks like power from a distance. From the inside, it is terror and loss and the grinding certainty that will end badly for everyone. The $500,000 contract that Scarfo is reported to have placed on Leonetti's head remains, as of this writing, technically outstanding. A price offered by a dead man on the life of a man in hiding. A ghost of violence from a world that no longer exists in the form that produced it. That the contract exists at all. That Scarfo could maintain that kind of hatred across decades of imprisonment right to the end of his life tells you something about the absolute consistency of his character. Angelo Bruno's family recedes into private life after his murder. His era becomes mythologized in some corners of the Philadelphia underworld as a kind of golden age. Unrealistically, perhaps, given that it was still a violent criminal organization, but the comparison with what Scarfo did afterward makes Bruno's years look almost idyllic. Philip Chicken Man Testa's family suffers a complete devastation of losing him to a nail bomb, then losing his son to a candy store ambush, then watching the organization that took both of them ultimately destroyed by the man who benefited from both deaths. Salvatore Salvi Testa, who deserves more than a footnote, who was by every account a genuinely extraordinary figure in the annals of organized crime, brilliant and capable and loyal and ultimately wasted, lies in Holy Cross Cemetery in Yeadon, Pennsylvania, next to his father. He is 28 years old forever. He dies because his boss was afraid of him. He dies because the man he trusted above all others brought him to a candy store and helped kill him. He dies because he was too good at his job and too beloved by the men around him, which in Nicodemo Scarfo's world meant he was too dangerous to live. His death is the turning point of the entire story. Everything before it is the rise. Everything after it is the fall. Nicodemo Scarfo Jr., Nicky Jr., the son who tried to carry his father's name in the Philadelphia streets and nearly died for it on Halloween 1989, provides one of the stranger and sadder postscripts to the main story. After his dramatic survival of the Batman mass shooting at Dante and Luigi's, Nicky Jr. is effectively expelled from the Philadelphia mob ecosystem. The city has rejected him as his father's proxy, and the message of the shooting, 6 bullets and not one kills him, which might be read as a warning rather than a serious attempt, is clear enough. He is not welcome in Philadelphia, not on his father's terms. Through his father's connections to the Lucchese crime family, specifically through the relationship between the senior Scarfo and Lucchese boss Vic Amuso, Nicky Jr. is relocated under Lucchese protection and eventually inducted into that family. He becomes a made member of the Lucchese's and rises within the organization to run their New Jersey operations, becoming a capo in the early 2000s. He is not his father in terms of violence or personal ferocity, but he carries the family's relationship with legal jeopardy. He is arrested, convicted, and sentenced on gambling charges multiple times. In the mid-2000s, he is implicated in the First Plus financial fraud scheme that also ensnares his imprisoned father. In 2015, the sentencing that defines the final chapter of his public legal history, 30 years in federal prison for racketeering, illegal gambling, and securities fraud. Father and son, serving decades in federal prison simultaneously. The Scarfo name and the federal prison system are, across 2 generations, nearly synonymous. Nicky Jr.'s children, the 3rd generation of this story, grow up with a grandfather in federal prison who dies there, and a father in federal prison who may not be released until they are adults themselves. Whatever the Scarfo name means to them, they've been thoroughly stripped of whatever glamour or power it once carried. It is now simply a weight, a history, a set of decisions made by people they may not fully understand, whose consequences they nonetheless carry. In all the analysis of Nicodemo Scarfo, the psychological assessments, the legal histories, the organized crime studies, the voices most easily lost are the voices of his victims, the 30 or so people who died on his orders, and the far larger number of people whose lives were disrupted, damaged, or destroyed by the broader waves of violence that his tenure generated. Vincent Falcone, the cement contractor who died for words spoken at a dinner. He was not a mobster. He was a businessman in a world where mob connections were unavoidable, and he made the mistake of being casual about a man who took nothing casually. He died at 30-something, in the winter of 1979, shot in the back of the head by his boss's nephew, and his death is recounted primarily as the anecdote that illustrates Scarfo's psychology, rarely as a loss of human life with its own weight and consequence. Judge Edwin Helfand, murdered in a restaurant with his wife sitting beside him because a bribe was refused. He was doing his job. He was upholding a law. He paid for it with his life because one man's wounded ego was more powerful than any other consideration. Frankie Flowers D'Alfonso, killed for being insufficiently obedient in his tribute payments. A bookmaker, a man of the streets, but a man nonetheless, with family and history, murdered so that the boss could demonstrate his absolute authority. Salvatore Testa, 28 years old, executed by his best friend in a candy store because his boss was afraid of how good he was. Each of these deaths ripples outward. Falcone leaves a family behind. Helfand leaves a widow who watched her husband die at dinner. D'Alfonso leaves relatives who grieve him. Testa leaves a legacy of grief so genuine that 300 people crowd a church in South Philadelphia to mourn him. Men who kill for a living, weeping for the loss of the one person in their world who made them feel like something more than instruments of someone else's violence. The violence of the Scarfo years is not abstract. It is specific, personal, and its consequences run through living people. The children of victims, the siblings, the parents, the friends. The families of Scarfo's victims do not get to write books or give interviews or achieve the narrative rehabilitation of Philip Leonetti. They simply carry the absence. They carry what was taken from them. And they carry it in the knowledge that the man who ordered those deaths died at 87, old, in a federal hospital, having outlived all his victims, having served his sentence, having, in the technical biological sense, won. So what is Nicodemo, Little Nicky, Scarfo's ultimate place in the history of American organized crime? What is the final assessment? He is not a figure of tragic greatness, like the mythologized version of the classic mob boss. He is not a strategic genius undone by external forces, like Lucky Luciano or Meyer Lansky. He is not even a flawed hero in Shakespearean mold, a capable man brought down by a single fatal flaw. His story does not have that kind of balance. What he is, in the clearest possible terms, is a warning about what happens when insecurity achieves power, a warning about what happens when the need for absolute control becomes indistinguishable from paranoia, a warning about what happens when an organization, any organization, makes a catastrophic error of placing an unfit person at its head and allows that person's pathology to run unchecked until there is nothing left to run. The Philadelphia crime family under Angelo Bruno was not a moral institution. It was a criminal organization that made money through illegal means and maintained its power through the threat of violence. But it was a functional institution, one that understood its own interests and governed itself accordingly. Angelo Bruno knew that his people were his assets, that their loyalty was earned through fair treatment and reliable protection, and that the rules he maintained were not just cultural artifacts but practical necessities. Scarfo dismantled every one of those understandings in 9 years. He treated his people as threats. He consumed his assets through paranoia. He broke the rules and then killed people for noticing that he had broken them. He demanded loyalty while demonstrating through his every action that loyalty meant nothing to him. And the result is not just the destruction of a criminal organization. The result is a destruction of everyone who touched it. The loyal soldiers who died for him, the associates who cooperated against him and enter a half-life in witness protection, the family members who lived in the wreckage of his choices, the victims who simply died. When Nicodemo Scarfo draws his last breath in the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina, on January 13, 2017, he is alone. Not alone in the sense of physically isolated. There are nurses, doctors, the institutional machinery of a federal medical facility. But alone in the sense that matters. No one is there who loves him. No one is there who has lived well in his shadow. No one is there who can say that this man made my life better, made the world around him more just or more functional or more humane. Philip Leonetti is somewhere in witness protection with a new name, a new life, children who grew up without the shadow of the mob. Nicholas Caramandi is somewhere under a different identity, having served his minimal time, having written his book, having made whatever pieces available to a man who killed for money and then testified to save himself. Thomas Del Giorno is wherever the witness protection program placed him, alive because of the deal he made, carrying the weight of what he admitted. His sons, Chris, who erased his name, Mark, who died in April 2014 after 25 years in a coma, the longest and most silent victim of Nicodemo Scarfo's story, Nicky Jr., who is in federal prison, beginning to serve 30 more years. The Philadelphia mob is a shadow of what was smaller, poorer, less connected, less feared, still prosecuted, but prosecuted for crimes of diminishing scale. Atlantic City is in the middle of its own complicated story of decline and attempted revival. The casinos that Scarfo's men died infiltrate either closed or struggling. The boardwalk quieter than anyone in 1983 would have believed possible. And Nicodemo Scarfo is dead, gone. The fear he generated, the power he wielded, the blood he spilled, all of it has been absorbed into history, into the files of the FBI and the transcripts of federal courts and the memoirs of the men who survived him. He wanted to be the most feared man in Philadelphia. In the specific, narrow, temporal sense, he achieved it. But fear is not legacy. Fear does not build anything that lasts. Fear is the most temporary of foundations, and everything built on it eventually collapses into exactly what the Philadelphia family became. Nothing. There is a quality of Greek tragedy to the life of Nicodemo Scarfo that is difficult to ignore. The man exiled to a dying city, who turns his exile into an empire. The man who reaches a throne only to destroy everything around him in his terror of losing it. The man who trusts nobody and thereby earns a betrayal of everybody. But Greek tragedy requires a hero, a figure of genuine greatness brought low by a fatal flaw. Scarfo does not quite achieve that status. His greatness is real. The patience of those Atlantic City years was genuine. The intelligence that built an empire out of nothing was genuine. The organizational capability that turned a regional crime family into a billion-dollar criminal enterprise during casino boom was genuine. These things deserve acknowledgement. But the flaw is not a single thing, not the clean, tragic hamartia of classical drama. The flaw is the whole man. The violence, the paranoia, the inability to be satisfied, the need to eliminate rather than manage, the refusal to trust, the reflexive cruelty. These are not separable from the rest of him. They are not an element of his character that coexists with a nobler self. They are the core. The rest is surface. He is, in the end, what his enemies said he was, a greedy, ruthless despot who reveled in wanton, senseless violence. The Philadelphia Daily News description, the undersized Atlantic City man with the oversized temper, is accurate as far as it goes, but it misses the deeper truth that Leonetti articulates in his book. That Scarfo's uncle was a man who could not be satisfied by anything short of absolute terror, who had confused fear with respect, who had mistaken the silence of terrified men for the loyalty of free ones. He spent 87 years on this earth. He spent the last 20 of them in a cage. He died having outlived his usefulness to everyone, outlived the relevance of the organization he spent his life building and destroying, outlived the fear that was the only currency he truly understood. His final legacy is this. The Philadelphia crime family, one of the oldest and most established organized crime organizations in America, has never recovered from his leadership. The city he ruled for 9 years is not better for having had him. The people who lived under his authority are not better for it. The men who serve him are dead, or imprisoned, or hiding under new names in cities they were assigned by federal marshals. He wanted to be remembered. Well, he is remembered. He is remembered as the mob boss who trusted nobody. And in trusting nobody, in treating loyalty as a threat and capability as a target and humanity as a weakness, he earned exactly what he deserved. To be betrayed by everyone, in the end, starting with himself. Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo, March 8th, 1929 to January 13th, 2017. He died as he lived, alone, surrounded by enemies, in the ruins of everything he built. The throne is empty. The empire is gone. The blood has dried and the city has moved on. And somewhere in Atlantic City on a cold January night, the waves still roll in from the Atlantic, indifferent as they have always been, washing over the boardwalk that was once the most dangerous piece of real estate in America, cleaning up everything that happened there, leaving it just sand and salt and the distant sound of something that was. And that, right there, is a complete and fully documented story of Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo, the most savage mob boss the city of Philadelphia ever produced, the man who built an empire and then burned it to the ground with his own hands. If you made it all the way through this video, I want you to know something. You just absorbed one of the most comprehensively documented rises and falls in the entire history of American organized crime. Now I want to hear from you in the comments. Drop your answer to this question. Who is more dangerous to be around? Nicodemo Scarfo, who might kill you for being too loyal, or John Gotti, who might kill you for being too visible? That is a genuine debate among people who study this world. And I want to know what you think. And here's my second question. Who betrayed who more? Did Philip Leonetti betray Nicodemo Scarfo by cooperating with the FBI? Or did Nicodemo Scarfo betray Philip Leonetti first, by building an organization where no man's loyalty was ever safe? Drop your answer below. I will be reading every single one. If this video gave you something, if it made you think, made you feel something, kept you watching at 2 a.m. when you should have been asleep, then do me one favor right now. Hit that like button. It takes 1 second, and it means everything for getting the story in front of more people who need to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the stories we tell on this channel are researched, documented, and told with the full weight they deserve. Share this video with someone who loves true crime and mob history. Tell them to block out 3 hours and sit down with this story. Tell them it starts slow and then it detonates. Tell them to stay until the end, because the ending is worth it. Next on this channel, we're going deep into another story from the same era, a story connected to Philadelphia, connected to Atlantic City, connected to the very world we have been exploring tonight. You are not going to want to miss it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching the whole thing. Thank you for being part of this community. See you in the next one.